Ladies and gentlemen, one of our professors has become world famous with his scientific work that might provide an answer to one of the challenges of the future. How can we continue to meet the growing global demand for meat in a sustainable manner? I would like to invite Professor Mark Post to give the DS lecture entitled Turning Out Hamburgers, a Typical Academic Enterprise. You have the floor, Professor Post.
Rector, President, colleagues, congratulations, happy birthday. All other guests, a warm welcome and thanks for joining us in this celebration. It's a great honor to stand here and deliver the DS lecture at the 40th anniversary of our university. I have a confession to make. This is not the place where you usually give confessions, I guess, but give sermons. My sermon will come later. But I graduated from high school in 1975, 1 year before this university started, and as many of you know, the medical school actually started 2 years earlier. So I could have studied here. And the word was out that it was a new place, experimental, adventurous, and I chickened out. I took Utrecht, which was also close by home. Today I would have chosen the more adventurous path. Not because I'm now at this university, but because I think that has now become sort of a lifestyle that I much more like than the regular one. And it turns out that over time, you get more adventurous. At least you can get more adventurous. It's something that is not an inborn trait. You can learn that. And I started to appreciate that more and more. And so is, by the way, creativity. It's not something that you have or have not, but you just can learn it. And I encourage everybody, and particularly the students, to start and look for that. The university is a teaching and research institute, and I feel therefore that I am exactly in the place that I want to be. Research can also be performed in other institutions, in industry, in specific research institutions. And I have collaborated over the last 25 years tremendously often with industry, and was always impressed by the rigor and quality of the research in industry. It's not really something that is specific for universities. When advising students, PhD students, on a future career path, I usually focus on teaching. Do you want to teach? Do you like to teach? Are you good at it? Do you think you're good at it? And if you do, yes, you can choose for academia. If you don't, please go to industry or go somewhere else, because that is not the combination that you want to look for here. Many students object that the freedom of research in industry would be less than in academia. And certainly some of that is true. I probably would not have been able to produce a hamburger from stem cells if I had been employed by, say, Philips to develop a new medical diagnostic. But on the other hand, that academic freedom is also heavily curtailed by our possibility to get funding for our research. So in my mind, the real difference between academia and industry or any other research institutions is not the quality of the research, is not even the academic freedom, but it's really whether you want to teach or not. Whether you do research in industry or in academia, in my mind, research is the most sort of gratifying thing to do in life. My mentor, Kees Borst, at the University of Utrecht, came, as some of you may know, from a long sort of history and family of academic people. And he always said to me, research is a way of life. It's not a career choice, it's really a way of life. And I strongly agree with that. Once you have adopted this lifestyle and have tasted the satisfaction of seeing your idea verified by experimentation or observing something that's completely unexpected, you are hooked forever. It's also a very useful attitude in life, beyond science. I once sat at a table of managers attending a Fresher Up course. That was in the time when I thought I might become a manager. When confronted with a problem, I suggested that this was problem-based learning. So they presented us with a problem, we had to come up with a solution. And my take on it was quite different from the other ones. And I said, well, you know, it's not really that important which choice you make, as long as you then observe what happens after that choice. And that was kind of a no-brainer for me, but apparently that was new to most of my fellow course followers. And what it essentially does, that experimental point of view, is that it relieves sort of the burden of choice in realizing that a choice is never finite, at least not a professional choice. And that you're already one step ahead of the game because you think through observation what will be the next step. Which brings me to observation. And I think right now what we are experiencing is that all the research that we are doing, especially in the biomedical field, but I think it's pretty much in other fields as well, the research is very much hypothesis-driven. It's actually pretty boring. You state a hypothesis, you do some experiments, you do some observations pretty much as an afterthought, and then you either refute or accept your hypothesis. It's a great sort of scheme to work by, but it may actually not be the most efficient way of doing it. And the reason for that is if you are so hooked up to your hypothesis, you are subjected to bias. And everybody pretty much knows this. In my opinion, observation is being undervalued in current strategies. It's very difficult to get observational studies funded or published. Scientific research has become too theoretical, that is, based on hypotheses. Grant applications and publications have to be based on hypotheses, and in the review process, more emphasis is placed on that hypothesis than on the data that are being acquired. And I propose that we start to reverse that. So one of the problems with that sort of theory-laden observation, if you like, is that there are biases. Confirmation bias is a very typical one. You do observations, you tend to pay much more attention to those observations that confirm your hypothesis than those that refute your hypothesis. And this can go to extreme ways. The other thing that hypothesis-driven research does is that it focuses your attention. And this is a very, some of you may know this is the missing gorilla experiment where, or the invisible gorilla experiment where the people who watch this video, and you should really, if you have never seen it, really look at the video, where should you look at this video, you get the assignment to count how many times the ball is being exchanged from one person to the other, and they run through each other, and you really have to focus to get that number correct. And then I will not spoil it for those of you who have not seen it, please look at it. But then something very unusually happens, and what's more unusual, most of the people who start counting never see this unusual thing. So they are very focused in their attention. That's another problem that we can face in research. And then finally, there is a third form of bias which may be even more sort of dangerous, and that's what's called cargo cult science. It's a term coined by Richard Feynman in 1975, and it's a kind of a strange term, but it basically says that we see what we expect to see. And it's based, the term comes from a practice in Polynesian islands where they saw right after the Second World War planes flying over. And they wanted some of these planes to land on their island, so they started to build wooden planes and landing strips to apparently trick pilots to land there. And I think cargo cult science is really a dangerous part of current hypothesis-driven research. The final problem with very sort of with a large emphasis on hypothesis-driven research is that you may actually miss observations that are unexpected. And my personal example was in 1995 when we were studying a process of restenosis. And restenosis is the narrowing of arteries after treatment. So when arteries are narrowed in your heart, for instance, you get a balloon dilation, the arteries pry open, and then within 6 months, 50% of the patients have a re-narrowing again and start complaining about their ischemia. And the prevailing theory was that this happened through an excessive healing response that was the result of proliferation of particular cells in that artery. And through very rigorous microscopic observation, we saw that actually the artery shrunk. And it was not really proliferation, but it was shrinkage of the artery, which led to this very interesting editorial, Honey, I Shrunk the Artery, which was a very popular movie at that time. So we have no theory about this, and we have no theory now how this happens, but it was an observation that facilitated the introduction of stents into cardiovascular treatment. So that especially the current prevalence of cargo cult science and its negative consequences on reproducibility of results require re-evaluation of the review process of grants and publications, and indeed the entire scientific culture. Paul Feyerabend, in its ultimate consequence, suggested to abandon scientific methodology and allow pretty much every method that leads to, whether it's music or any other art form or public observations, that leads to more knowledge, also known as methodological anarchy. So when are we getting to the hamburger? You were all wondering, I guess. This was the hard part of the lecture. It becomes easier right now. The creation of a hamburger is a pretty academically straightforward process. It's a science of tissue engineering applied to food. Tissue engineering is the creation of tissues, of organs in the lab using cells, usually patients' own cells, and supportive biomaterials. The technology platform is developed to replace or supplement dysfunctional organs in the body. Tissue engineering can also be used to culture meat for consumption. It's also a tissue. When I first came across this concept, it was not my original idea. It soon became clear to me that this application was A, perhaps easier to achieve than tissue engineering for medical applications, and B, would tackle a grand global challenge already referred to by the rector. The grand global challenge indeed is to ensure global food security in the wake of increasing meat demand. As India and China become wealthier, meat demand increases, and we go from 7 to 9 billion people, and also that increases our meat demand. And to curb the environmental impact of livestock meat production. About 15 to 20% of all our greenhouse gas emission comes from livestock. Through a couple of seemingly serendipitous events, my lab was eventually the first to produce a hamburger made from muscle-specific stem cells derived from the cow. The technology is fairly simple and relies on a remarkable self-organization of the stem cells in culture, providing you create the right environment. We took the step to present that hamburger in a worldwide televised event, which is kind of unusual. I've been working in cardiovascular science for 25 years, never have done anything like this. So why did we do that? Why a televised event? We were working on that project. It was initially funded by the Dutch government. At some point, they stopped funding because they didn't stop funding, but they didn't renew it, saying, well, we don't see any public interest, and we don't see any interest from the industry. A perfect illustration how, in my mind, governments and large industries are incapable of disruptive innovations. So we decided to, well, we thought it was a great idea, and if there's no public interest, we will generate public interest. So we will televise the event. And at the time that we actually came to that event, we no longer needed the funding, but it was still a great thing to do for 2 reasons. One is we wanted to kill the whole discussion, this cannot be done. And second, we wanted to sensitize the larger public. This is a public sort of debate, the larger public, that there is an upcoming crisis with meat production. So this is a small excerpt of that video. We presented that hamburger in a Petri dish. It was cooked by a very courageous chef. The hamburger was €250,000 worth. He didn't burn it. And it was tasted by two tasters, independent tasters from Vienna and from Chicago. And they said it was okay. It was meat. And the taste was not quite what they had hoped for because there was no fat in it. So it was an imperfect product. It was basically a concept. So, in fact, the years preceding this event, there was already a lot of media interest. And going public like this is something that in science is kind of unnerving because you open yourself up to a lot of criticism. You now have suddenly a much larger audience. And your colleagues not necessarily appreciate it. There's, I guess, still a sentiment that science is serious business and should be communicated only in serious journals. Although I obviously support the need to subject reports to on experimental and observational work to rigorous review, it's unnecessarily arrogant and short-sighted to express disdain about informing the general public of scientific advance. After all, it's the public, the taxpayers, you, who pays our salaries and is particularly entitled to information on the results of its investments. Not only is it the right thing to do, it's also very educational, I can tell you, and creates a great experimental platform. You can bounce off ideas of people with different backgrounds and gain more insight as you move along. Opinions, brainwaves, and cultural expressions are sometimes more insightful than facts. Again, this methodological anarchy. I believe that making laymen partner in discovery, or teaching for that matter, can only improve the scientist and the science. This belief should not be interpreted as a wish to democratize science. Given the layman public a big say in what should be investigated and what not, will inevitably also lead to common denominator research and will curb the opportunity for radical ideas and innovations. The universities or institutes of higher education should cherish their role as front runners in society, an elite corps operating at the front line of knowledge and not hindered by public controversies. Yet they should be fully willing to be transparent and to engage with the taxpayer. Of course, some subjects lend themselves much better to public debate than others. Per request, I'm covering science news in a regionally broadcasted show, Avondgasten on L1, on subjects of my choosing, another fun thing to do. An item on microwave interference pattern observed by the BICEP 2 telescope, providing further evidence for the warp speed expansion of the universe after the Big Bang, met with much less enthusiasm than the discovery that the hugging hormone oxytocin gets released when a cute dog looks at you faithfully. And it doesn't only get released in your brain, but also in that of the dog's. This is the only reference to dogs that I'm going to make. In the absence of formal training, you learn by trial and error how to handle the public debate. But you can, and in my opinion, should try. So that Hamburger was a proof of concept, a concept car like you wish, something that may not be produced. It's not a real product yet. Making a product out of this concept is an absolute requirement for solving those problems that I mentioned. Being passionate about those global challenges, food security, environment, animal welfare maybe, and possibly to provide a solution, the drive to go through a product development stage is naturally present. It's not something that you have to think about too long. Some of the product development can be done in academia, and this is exactly what we have done over the last 2 years. However, it's an academic enterprise to make 3 hamburgers. It's no longer an academic enterprise to make 10,000 hamburgers. So we have to culture, for instance, a lot of cells. It's a scale-up of production. And so we are about now to start a company, Mosa Meat, to scale up production on cultured meat and go through regulatory approval. For a leather product, we started Corium. Many hurdles are undoubtedly ahead of us, and we will also enter stages that we question the attainment of final success, but we are determined to give it our best shot. The start of companies was thus a logical step in the process towards providing a solution for a pressing societal problem. The fact that it makes life again more complex held me back in previous years, but can no longer be used as an excuse. Embracing complexity is, after all, a part of the research way of life, and I'm sure it will turn out to be a great learning experience again. Coming to an end, we have 40 years behind us as a cool place to work and get educated, where crazy and radical ideas can still flourish, provided we continue to convince the taxpayer in supporting the institution. Visible outcomes that provide solutions to real-life problems help tremendously in raising that support. For the science that does not immediately or visibly lead to a product or societal benefit, the necessity to engage with the public is even more pressing. An equally interesting and important task for the next 40 years is to regain attractiveness as an employer in the eyes of upcoming talent in research and teaching. This likely does not come from showing that we are just professionals who conduct normal science in the expression of Paul Kuhn, but are rather adventurers who work on grand global challenges. In other words, engage in a truly academic enterprise and live on the edge. Thank you for your attention.